Well, hello and welcome live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you for tuning in. You are watching The Week Ahead with myself, Liesl Wilson. You can interact with us on our various social media platforms at The Week Ahead, or you can use the hashtag The Week Ahead. Let's get straight into it. Right, first up, the nomination for the leadership of the ANC in the Northwest has seen current Premier Bushi Mape and former ANC MP Lono Maloyi squaring up for the position of provincial chairperson. Both Lassie Mokhosi and Paul Sibego are vying for the position of the provincial deputy chair. Let's get the latest from our SABC News reporter, Untitled Chapter, who's in Rustenburg, where the ANC's Northwest Conference is currently happening. Untitled, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here, obviously for an update. Perhaps provide us what's happening on your end. How hotly contested are the top positions in that province as we're speaking?
Well, a very good day to you, Liesl, and our viewers at home. Currently coming to you from the Rustenburg Civic Center. What we're going to do now is that we see one of the contenders or nominees for the chairmanship of the Northwest Province, Lono Maloyi. We're just going to talk to them as, you know, delegates here way to vote. We know that voting is going to take any minute from now. Sorry to hijack you, Mr. Maloyi. Thanks so much for your time. Yesterday you were nominated. You know that this conference had its own delays. How are you feeling now? Are you anxious?
No, I'm okay. There's no difference between today and yesterday. So I'm just okay.
Just talk to us in terms of, you've been here since the beginning of this conference. The way you read the mood, how the conference went. We know that today is supposed to be the last day and it's a bit delayed, and we can see that your supporters behind you keep on singing just to keep that momentum.
Yeah, no, this conference took longer than expected. We were supposed to have dealt with commissions by now. And in commission, this is where we deal with ANC policy and so on. And conferences are
Right, our reporter Untitled Chapter again at the Rustenburg Civic Center, where the ANC's Northwest elective conference is currently transpiring. Perhaps for more, let's cross to our other reporter, who is also stationed in Rustenburg, Zebulon Maine, for an update on his end. Good afternoon to you, Zebulon. We've just lost connection with Untitled. Perhaps you can give us an update on what is transpiring on your end. We do understand that the day has been marred by some delays somewhat.
Good afternoon. Indeed, we are here outside Civic Center, where we understand that the conference was supposed to be convened 4 hours ago, but there are some sort of delays that are taking place currently. But what we have discovered is that there are allegations that there are accreditations that were discovered at Olympia Stadium. You'll understand that ever since the beginning of this conference, members of the ANC, before they are allowed at the venue, they have to go to Olympia Stadium.
We do apologize for those technical issues. As soon as it's sorted, we'll get back to the issue at hand. We've got a lot of stories to get through at the SAWA. Let's take a look at another story that will be making headlines this week. The tragedy that befell the Marikana community in Northwest in 2012 is mostly remembered for the mass killing, which occurred on the 16th of August. But less has been said about the violence in the days prior to this tragedy that claimed the lives of 10 people, 6 workers, 2 police officers, and 2 security guards. Our reporter Sentliang Leyi and Jabu Wa Africa chronicle these events, which culminated in the Marikana massacre.
The strike action by platinum mine workers caused tension from the outset. The bloodshed escalated on the 13th of August 2012. A usually calm railway crossing at Marikana turned into a crime scene in a matter of seconds as striking mine workers became more violent. When they were eventually dispersed, 2 police officers were lying dead in the bushes. Not far from them were 3 bodies of mine workers. That's when it became evident that the strike was becoming more violent and that police reinforcements were needed. 10 years later, the video journalist who captured those graphic visuals says little did he know the worst was yet to come.
Re ile kwa ka lebaka la gore go no go gotela yana shouldn't se le go 2 weeks in zile on ha re tsena kwa re fitlhelele gore ke nnete ma security guards a mabedi a ile a tlhokafala be ba ofisi go tsena ga rona mo re ithetse le melora fela mme ka ntle re se izuru ka nte go bua nnete ke ina tshimologo ya loeto la rona go Marikana mme ga tsamaya lo 5 6 7 8 day. That's when a tip off ya gore there are some cars doing more a carport somewhere in one of the shafts.
Moses says before long all hell broke loose.
Ka the 10th day ke lone tota se le golo le ene gore le nkusa go tlhogo tota mo go nna ka gore e na tiragalo mo tota e busula e ka se ntse I'll never forget it. To see somebody being hacked like that, no. Wow.
While driven by his journalistic passion to deliver the story then, Moses now wonders if he still has the same courage today. Sintle English, SABC News, Marikana.
Right, after the break, we're going to be chatting to Hajra Marji, political editor at Business Day, and Tandu Kolo Jiga, investigative journalist at the Sunday Times. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The week ahead continues with myself, Liesl Wilson. We return to our earlier story where the nomination of the leadership of the ANC in the Northwest has seen current Premier Bushi Mape and former ANC MP Nono Maloyi squaring up for the position of provincial chairperson. In fact, our reporter Nhlanhla Khatlane was in conversation with Nono Maloyi just before we had some technical difficulties. We're going to cross back to him live at the Civic Centre in Rustenburg for more. Nhlanhla, good afternoon. If you can hear me, welcome back. Let's take a look at what's transpiring on your end. I mean, there's a hotly contested, it's a hotly contested rather for the top positions in the province. Perhaps you can give us an update on what's transpiring on your end.
Well, indeed, Liesl, sorry about the earlier glitches. We were speaking to one of the nominees here who was nominated yesterday for the position of chairmanship of the part of the ANC in the Northwest Province. Let's continue with our conversation with him. Sorry about the technicalities earlier. Yeah, you were saying, talk to us about you, how you feel now that the voting is coming. It's close. Coming close.
No, I'm okay. I feel energized, quite excited that finally members of the ANC will take a decision as to who should lead this province in the ANC and guide our deployees in government. So we are quite excited that we have arrived here.
Last question from me. What is it that you're going to bring? We know that this province also, struggled with, unity. We heard the deputy president in his opening remarks saying that, the ANC is at the crossroad and, calling on delegates here to choose capable leaders that would ensure that, ordinary South Africans remembers the ANC for a party that it was not for the wrongdoings.
Unity of the ANC is paramount. It's very key. And unifying the ANC is not an event. It's a process. It is, of course, going to take time. But if we are all committed, firstly as leaders of the ANC and as ordinary members of the ANC, we will be able to achieve this objective. But that unity should not be a cosmetic unity. There must be a program of action. Because talking about unity without a program will not assist. Once you have a program at a branch level, at a regional level, and at a provincial level, it means each and every member of the ANC will then know what is it that they need to do on a daily basis when they wake up in order to rebuild, renew, and unify the ANC, in order to attend to issues of service delivery in our different communities and so on. So that unity which we are talking about is unity of purpose.
Are you happy, despite the fact of the delays, are you happy with how everything has been going since you guys came here?
Yeah, I am happy. I must just indicate that the unfortunate thing is that adoption of credentials took longer than expected. Whilst I agree that this is a festival of ideas, branches of the ANC must be given an opportunity to interact with any matter that affects their functioning, that affects the running of this conference and so on and so forth. But it took longer. I had expected it to take about an hour or two, but this one took more than 4 hours.
Well, thank you so much. Lizel, that was one of the nominees here who will be contesting for the chairmanship, saying that unity of the ANC is paramount. If you remember, the deputy president of the ANC, in his opening remarks yesterday, did speak to the importance of ensuring that delegates that came here need to remember to do the right thing, need to remember to do the right thing by South Africans, saying that South Africans are losing trust when it comes to the ANC, saying that the good that has been done by the ANC previously and to date, it's overshadowed by the wrongdoing, calling them to ensure that they come together and unite. But we are walking to the current premier, and who's also been nominated for the chairmanship. We're going to try and hijack Thank you so much for your time. Sorry for hijacking you. How are you feeling?
Chairman. No, I'm just all right. I'm attending conference with other delegates. I'm just feeling all right.
Since you came here from Friday, we know that there's been delays. Talk to us about, how the conference has went.
Very peaceful up to this stage.
The president spoke yesterday about, calling on delegates here to try by all means and choose leaders that are capable to lead the province, saying that, they must ensure that they remind South Africans, and especially people here in the province, that the ANC has done good and, move away from doing the wrong thing. So your view on that?
The president, the deputy president delivered the message, and I think the delegates will take that message into account when they vote for their preferred candidates.
What is it that, if you emerge victorious, we know that you guys here in the province has been struggling with, unity. What is it that you're going to prioritize to ensure that the ANC is seen as the party that it was?
Must you count your chicken before they hatch. Let's wait for that to happen, and then I'll have a comment.
Your plans in terms of, the plans that you have as a nominee?
No plans at all. The delegates will decide.
Thank you so much, sir. That is the current premier here, and also the nominee of the chairmanship is going to be contesting. But we know that in a couple of minutes they are going to go in and start voting. Lizel, with that being said, it's back to you in studio.
Very much, Nhlanhla. Perhaps if you can still hear me, you could just outline what the set program for the rest of the day is going to look like. Do you have any word on that as we're speaking?
Well, Lisa, we know that the president is expected to come here and close the conference. It's delayed. It was supposed to have started at 9 o'clock. There's voting that's going to take place. We know that the commissions are also going to sit, but this far they are running late. But since Friday, this conference has been running late. We remain to see if things will try and catch up with regards to time, but the energy here is still the same. Quite a number of delays, and like I mentioned earlier, that the president of the ANC is expected to close this conference.
Thank you very much for that update. Nhlanhla Kgatlana is at the Rustenburg Civic Centre, bringing us the latest from the ANC Northwest Elective Conference currently transpiring. We're going to go back to our other reporter, Zebulon Maine, who is also in Rustenburg. Zebulon, we lost you a little bit earlier. Perhaps you could give us the latest. What is transpiring on your end?
Thank you very much. Indeed, we are here outside Civic Centre where some members of the ANC, as you can see behind me here, there are some members of the ANC sitting under the tree. But the issue is that the conference was supposed to be convened 3 hours ago, but there are some delays that are taking place. But currently what we understand that is that some members of the ANC Youth League managed to discover some 40 accreditations which do not have people that they belong to. But we are going to speak to the ANC Youth League chairperson, Wessels Moreng, who's going to give us the background with regards to the accreditation that they have found 3 kilometers away from the venue, which is Olympia Stadium, where members of the ANC will firstly have to go register and be accredited. Wessels Moreng, thanks very much for joining us, my brother. I can see that you have some accreditations here. Who are they belong to?
Look, firstly, we want to express our utter disappointment to the team of Little House that has been sent here. I mean, it remains our vehement conviction that they are subjective. Yesterday, there was a rush when it comes to adoption of credentials, wherein Comrade Malusi solemnly adopted credentials on his own against the will of the majority that were debating credentials. Now, we discovered 40 texts, which now gives an explanation as to why the NEC made those rush with regards to adoption of credentials. So from where we are seated, we are questioning the credibility of the process. I mean, when we learned yesterday with jubilation that the IPC is not going to run process, we are comforted that the process will be fair. But now we realize that there's subjectiveness from the level of the NEC members that are deployed to run this process. So as a matter of the way forward, as the ANC Youth League were saying, this conference is not going to continue because its credibility is under question.
Now, how did you manage to discover this accreditation? Is it only these accreditations or there are some others?
Our members of the Youth League, because they are on the ground, they've learned that there's some printing of text that is continuing. I mean, when they got there, those comrades, they ran away. So they managed to repossess this text. And then we realized that, I mean, for instance, I've got the name of Kotsole Shuma. The Kotsole Shuma is here in the conference. So there's been double production of text to try to mitigate numbers. Because like I indicated to you, the subjectiveness of some NEC members, they realize that the lobby groups that they are pushing for is not going to conquer. Now they went to be malicious, to become pickpocketers and make sure that they produce more text for them to be able to push for a certain agenda that they are pushing. So we are saying to the NEC members, we respect them, they are our leaders, but this that they are doing is to undermine the decorum of the organization. This is to undermine the unity and the renewal of the organization. This leadership, we are not going to accept it should they wish to continue. Because I'm told they are prepared, they are even going to unleash security on us. And that will be the collapse of the conference. Because we are waiting for the plenary to resume, wherein we are going to raise these matters. I mean, we are not fabricating things, we've got evidence before us. This is the evidence that we are even showing the nation, that this process is under question. I mean, for instance, we were told in the morning yesterday, when we took a break after the nomination, that we are going to start at 9 o'clock. Now, they learned that they are behind with 40 delegates as far as the issue of margin is concerned. Now, the process has to be stalled until this time around. I think it's 2 o'clock. so that these shenanigans can take place for them to be able to mitigate the issue of margins. So, comrades, we are not apologetic. We're not going to be intimidated in our Congress. We are representing branches. We are representing majority. We are majority of young people. We are representing aspirations of the people of the Northwest. This is not the conference of the ANC. This is not how the conference of the ANC should be ran. We're not going to be intimidated. We are waiting for that security. If it means it must collapse, it must collapse. If it means there must be physical clarity, there is going to be physical clarity. We're not going to be scared. We are waiting readily available for that ANC. We are going to plan our. This conference is going to collapse.
We understand that you're supposed to reconvene anytime from now. Now, going forward, when you go inside there, what is it that you're going to do to make sure that your matter is being heard by the NEC members?
Look, within confinements of the organization, we are going to raise this matter sharply. But the attitude that they demonstrated yesterday, we know that they are not going to listen to us. Like I've just made an example to you that we're busy in the middle of debating credentials. To our show, Comrade Malusi just said the credentials are adopted. But we will try by all means to exhaust all organizational processes. But if those organizational processes they are met with anarchy, we're also going to meet anarchy with anarchy. We don't have a choice.
Based on what we have discovered, do you think that this conference is legitimate?
This conference is not legitimate from where we're seated. I mean, we've got evidence before us. We're not fabricating. These texts were repossessed while the printing that was unlawful, the printing that was against the processes of the organization was taking place. I mean, yesterday we made peace with the fact that in as much as unfair as it is that the credentials were out, we were willing to continue with the conference. But this, they've went above board. This, for a lack of better words, it's really an anarchy to the organization. I mean, that is being that is being fabricated by leaders that we expect that they should be able to provide organizational to us as members. I mean, what is this thing? 40 texts were produced while we're told that the printing of text has been closed. We adopted credentials yesterday. What is this thing? In all honesty, if we are fair.
So in that case, based on the discovery of this, are you saying that the conference might be interrupted?
We are going to debate this issue so that everyone can come to his consciousness and realize that this is wrong. But we know, like I told you, their attitude will be to unleash security on us. But I'm telling you, we are going to meet anarchy with anarchy. This conference is not going to continue. Its credibility is under question.
Thank you very, very much. That is ANC Youth League Chairperson Wessels Moring giving us the update with regards to the discovery of accreditations for there are about 40 of them, but he's saying that they are going to raise this matter once they go inside the conference. With that, back to you in studio.
Thank you very much for that update. Zebulon Maine, also stationed in Rustenburg, bringing us the latest. Again, you heard there from the ANC Youth League chairperson questioning the legitimacy of the conference. This as some 40 tags were found, perhaps also speaking to the credibility of the process, which is still underway in Northwest. Again, a developing story. We'll continue to monitor on the SABC as it unfolds. Back to one of our earlier stories. We're going to be bringing in Hadra Omarji, political editor at Business Day, and Tandu Xolo Jiga is an investigative journalist at the Sunday Times to speak to the tragedy, that befell the Marikana community in the Northwest back in 2012. Mostly remembered for the mass killing which occurred on the 16th of August. Let me welcome you both to the show. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC today.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Hadra, let me start with you. Perhaps you can take us back to the days leading up to the massacre as you were covering the story. What were the conversations on the ground with the miners who were seeking salary increments? What was the mood and atmosphere like as you reflect back?
So I think if I look back 10 years and having been on the ground in Marikana, what struck me is that it was a dark stain on our constitutional democracy. And the reason is we were very quick to call workers who granted were carrying very deadly weapons barbaric. But I do believe it was also an indication of how far we've come, but how far we still need to go in terms of the employer's role in the life of workers and the government's role to provide basic services. Lonmin was compliant in terms of basic working conditions, in terms of paying minimum wages, but the employer did not care that their workers were living in absolute squalor. So while many at the time called workers barbaric, I would go as far as to say the employer, in that case Lonmin, as well as the South African government, were barbaric in their response to how workers were living. And I think the situation could have been diffused if workers, the employer, and government sat around the table and had a conversation where they genuinely tried to understand each other's struggles. At the time, Lonmin were making mega profits, as mining companies around the country still do. And yes, workers were paid the minimum wage, were demanding 12,500 rand a month, but they were living in squatter camps with no facilities to go to the toilet or to bath themselves. It was, if they had bothered to speak to the workers before they gave the police ammunition, live ammunition, I do believe Marikana could have been avoided. I also think that commissions are used to quell public outrage, but 10 years later, the findings and the recommendations of the Farlam Commission into Marikana have still not been fully implemented.
Well, Haja, you've raised a lot of interesting and important points that we will discuss as the conversation continues. Tandu Xolo, let me bring you into the conversation. Perhaps just looking back 10 years later, where were you? Take us back to the days leading up to the massacre. What was happening on the ground? What were you observing?
I think Hajra said most of the things. At the time, of course, what we now know, that massacre could have been avoided. The 10 days before that massacre, a lot of people were dying, but there was no interest from either Lonmin government and other stakeholders to actually, quell the strike. Instead, they were just labeled as disgruntled mine workers who did not want to adhere to their agreements on their table from previous times. And as a result, there was this tension between NUM and AMCU. And in my view, had government intervened and Lonmin listened, we would have avoided all the killings that even happened before the massacre. And it seems even today, in my view, that we have learned nothing from the Marikana massacre. I mean, just last year alone, government stood by for a number of days during the July riots, which claimed over 300 lives. Within the second day, one would have hoped that government would have stepped in. Every resource would have been actually pushed towards KZN to ensure that there are no more lives lost, similar to what happened in Marikana. And that just shows you how we have learned so little, and that even the Farlam Commission recommendations were never actually taken seriously, because Farlam made a lot of recommendations, especially when it comes to public policing. I know for a fact that after the Farlam Commission, I think in 2018, a number of police officers were, recruited, and then the then police commissioner, Kesa Sitole, spent a lot of millions into public policing. That did not translate to anything if we are to go about, looking at what happened in KZN last year. For me, it said there were no lessons learned from Marikana, and still government drags its feet when it comes to issues of riots in the country.
Tandu Xolo, you've actually touched on my next point, so I'm going to bring Hydra back into the conversation because it is around the issue of policing in South Africa. And Hydra, I wonder if you could speak to, how it brings to the fore, the massacre rather brings to the fore the breakdown of, both political and social mechanisms that have traditionally allowed a society to negotiate complicated disagreements and clashes of interest, and how we've perhaps take lessons learned, but also not learned lessons just on the back of what happened in July last year.
Just to pick up on what Thando Xolo closed with, there were many recommendations and findings on the SAPS, and it dealt with public order policing. 9 years after those findings and recommendations were made, we saw a complete breakdown of law and order in the country during the July riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, which means those findings and recommendations were not implemented in the spirit in which they should have been implemented, number one. Number two, we still don't know who gave the order to send live ammunition to what was a violent wage dispute at the time. And number three, workers then, and more so now, no longer have a seat at the table because they got caught in the middle of a spat for members between the NUM as well as AMCU at the time. And you had worker leaders in COSATU at the time, in the NUM at the time, as well as President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was then a non-executive director at Lonmin, calling on government to take concomitant action for the violence that some other non-protesting workers suffered in the days leading up to the Marikana massacre. I don't think we have internalized that. I don't think we have accepted responsibility or culpability for that. I think the Farnham Commission was used to quell public outrage. And then as we sit and wait for President Ramaphosa's response to the State Capture Commission, history may well repeat itself because we don't take governance seriously. And we need to take governance seriously, whether we are a worker, an employer, or government. And 10 years ago, to me, Marikana was just an epic fail on all sides. You can't just call workers barbarians and not call the same out for the employer who saw their workers living in appalling conditions. And by the way, to date, my colleague Luyolo at Business Day visited Marikana recently. The majority of workers are still living in that squatter camp 10 years later.
So, Hydra, you're speaking about issues of leadership and apology. Also, 10 years later, as we reflect back on the lessons learned, even the attitudes of big businesses to the plight of underpaid workers. And maybe you could speak to how it's resurfacing once again as we see similar issues arising in the past few weeks, but also given the transition of South Africa's political economy. How has it reproduced or reinforced the country's social inequalities?
So, well, there's no excuse for violence. However, we need to understand what is justifiable anger. And what is justifiable anger is when workers do everything that they can in order to be heard, and they are simply ignored. Is it wrong of them to try to demand a hearing? And we've seen in protests over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years, that ordinary communities or worker communities embark on violence as a last resort. To simply come out and say that violence is unacceptable is failing in your leadership mandate as an employer. However, if you do speak to workers at Lonmin, and I've visited Marikana a few times since 2012, they say things did improve dramatically under Ben Mgara when he was the CEO at Lonmin. You had a constant conversation between workers and the employer. They understood each other. Now that Stillwater has bought Lonmin, workers are now saying it's gone back to their being completely, they removed from reality. So I think what we need to do, if we are genuine about addressing worker concerns, is that worker leaders need to have the interest of their union members at heart and not self-interest. And employers need to explain to us why miners in Australia, for example, get paid far more than miners in South Africa. We come from a model of slave labor. And while employers and the government are doing the bare minimum in terms of what they need to legally do, we've not yet reached economic freedom where the employer and a union leader or a worker have an equal place at the negotiation table.
Thando Xolo, do you want to just echo on the back of what Hydra just shared?
I mean, for me, it's, looking forward in terms of the lack of political will seems to be the Achilles heel in our country. We're constantly seeing these type of disagreements, which end up in serious riots where lives are lost simply because there is no proper political will. Actually, there's no political will to address issues of just basic income, basic living conditions of human beings in South Africa still continue to be of the same quality as it was in the 1900s, which shows that there's continued exploitation of workers in South Africa. There is continued collusion between the state and the big companies, which is where you can see there's actually no balance, and the interests of the majority are actually pushed towards the back, and which is where I agree with Hajra to say that there's just continued exploitation. And government just keeps on making promises, and then big business, they just threaten to leave the country if government doesn't do ABC, etc., etc. So there is no point where we are meeting to say, actually, this is where we want to see South Africa go. This is where we want to see workers being paid properly. We seem to be working backwards and there's no political will. And of course, that is also influenced by the fact that there is so much political instability in the country. The ruling party itself is not stable, and its instability directly translates to government instability. And hence you've got people able to do whatever they want to do because there's no one driving the plane to say so.
Well, Thando, in the interest of time, I just want to wrap up the conversation. I mean, both you and Hajra were on the ground 10 years ago, and I wonder if you could just very briefly speak to the trauma that you went through in covering this story, perhaps how you managed to debrief or how it continues to haunt you 10 years later.
Well, journalists tend to run into the fire while everyone else is running away from the fire. So it was a privilege and an honor having been on the ground in Marikana. I mean, there are reporters that spent day and night there. I wasn't one of them. There are reporters that called the mining strikers barbarians, and I think as a media we've got to take some culpability for how we projected a legitimate cause of striking workers. And yes, we should absolutely show the violence that preceded what happened before the massacre. But I also think that in terms of lessons learned, we haven't learned much. And if we don't learn from history, then it might well repeat itself. And I think that is the big danger.
Thando, in conclusion, your closing thoughts.
Well, for me, I mean, again, it is about, what does the future actually hold for us? I was there. It was a privilege, I mean, to document what was happening in Marikana, living there, with the mine workers in Nkaning settlement. It still hurts up until today to see people living in the same squalor conditions when, there's billions that are made off their backs. As mine workers. So for me, it is about actually having proper conversations that actually deal with the problems at heart, not to actually just treat the wound, but what is actually causing the wound.
Alhajra Omarji, political editor at Business Day, and Tandu Jiga, investigative journalist at the Sunday Times, reflects ahead of the Marikana massacre, which obviously is going to culminate on the 16th of August 2022, 10 years later, in which 34 miners were killed. We'll leave the conversation there. Take a quick ad break. More on the other side. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The week ahead continues with myself, Liesl Wilson. In other news now, the issue of land is central to South Africans, given the legacy of apartheid. Perhaps as we also navigate the meaning of urban and rural land rights to date, with proposed legislation being introduced. Now, these and other topics will be explored at the Land Conference 2022, taking place between the 17th and the 19th of August. And it really brings to the fore issues around tenure security in relation to customary land rights, as well as dispossession. Nokwanda Sihlali, Senior Researcher at Land and Accountability Research Centre at UCT, weighs in for more. A very good afternoon to you, Nokwanda. Thanks for joining us here on the SABC.
Hi, Liesl. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump straight into the conversation. I mean, just given the systemic issues inherited from an oppressive past, and also looking at issues around security of tenure for rural citizens, following a land summit also that was held earlier this year, that obviously touched on a lot of similar issues that you're also going to be exploring again this time around. Perhaps you could walk through this conference intended purpose.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, as you're mentioning, there has been a land summit and land consultations that have happened already. But the main premise of our land conference is centered on making sure that the voices of the people who are affected by all these laws are actually there. So the conference is looking at the failed promise of tenure security. I mean, we have tenure security installed in our constitution under Section 25(9), and then at Section 25(6), and then you have Section 25(9), which gives us IPILRA. IPILRA in itself is sort of a weapon that's used by rural citizens against dispossession and deprivation of land, but obviously it's an interim act. So this is something that needs to actually be more solidified. The solution that Parliament has given us is the Communal Land Tenure Bill. So we've had a lot of problems, from being CLARA, being to the CLTP, now to being the CLTP. So these are some of the things that we're going to be exploring when it comes to customary land rights, especially in the former Bantu stance. So it's a conference that's happening from the 17th till the 19th of August. It's going to be in 3 provinces. It's going to be in Gauteng, it's going to be in KZN, Eastern Cape, and we actually just recently secured a venue here in Cape Town at Webber-Wentzel. So the premise is, even if you have land conferences around rural citizens, you cannot only target traditional leaders, you cannot only target experts of land, academics, you cannot target town planners only. So it needs to actually have the rural citizens there. And that's the main premise of us having the actual venues. But the actual event is going to be online, so people can register to participate from anywhere in the world.
Nokwanda, so you're speaking about the laws, policy and advocacy initiatives that are required, perhaps to ensure that rural citizens are heard. And an issue that's come to the fore, perhaps, is looking at the issue of expropriation by large mining companies without proper compensation for these rural communities. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I know this topic has not really garnered as much attention, perhaps, as your more mainstream talks about land expropriation without compensation.
Yes, I mean, you know what, Liesl, the idea of expropriation, I think it's been so out of touch with actually what's happening. The things, I also hate this thing of on the ground, but with what's actually happening and the lived realities of people. We're talking about it as though it's a future thing that should scare us. It's an alien spaceship that we need to prepare for. It's already here. It's already happening in the rural communities. Rural communities are facing, as I said, IPILRA is a weapon that's used to sort of say, no, if you want to mine under my land, you need to get my consent. You need to consult me. And consent is ongoing. Consent is not just asking one time. And then you have to understand that what a person is going to lose when they lose that land is not only what's underneath. You're going to lose the air. You're going to lose the water. You're affecting forestry. You're affecting the general geography of that space. So losing land is losing livelihoods. It's sometimes losing sources of income. It's losing food production. So that understanding, when mining companies come and have the ability to sign sort of contracts without having consulted and received consent from those directly affected. So that's what IPURA sort of emphasizes, those directly affected. So as a community, we can take a decision that we want Babu Tembu's land to be expropriated because we found some minerals, or we want to build something to benefit the community. But he would need to get much more compensation, much more understanding in terms of how he's going to be affected than the rest of the community. So the idea that, okay.
Yeah, because you're speaking about policy processes, perhaps also informed consent, and then really having the community's voices heard. In the interest of time, though, as we explore some of the other issues that are set to come to the fore, I mean, you can't ignore the role of women. And I wonder if you could speak to why it's important for women to be at the forefront of these discussions. I mean, women are usually the most vulnerable when it comes to even attending traditional courts.
Yes, you're very correct, because even with the recent judgment of the Maledu judgment, it's playing a very significant role, especially connected to sort of mining communities. As I said, sometimes they'll just engage with the traditional leader and then start expropriating people without having discussed compensation. What the Maledu judgment, which was led by Grace Maledu, she's actually going to be one of our speakers in the opening plenary on the Wednesday. So she's going to also just share her experiences of being in this 15-year battle, sending their case to the Constitutional Court where they won it, where they actually said, we were independent land buyers, we were forced to affiliate with the traditional community in the larger sense, but we actually own this land. The Ingonyama Trust judgment actually did say that the true owners of the land are the people who live on it. So it's not necessarily the idea that traditional leaders own land. Traditional leaders are sort of custodians of culture, but not necessarily the owners of the land.
Well, there's obviously a lot and more that will be explored through the week, but we'll have to leave the conversation there. Nokwanda Sihlali is a senior researcher at the Land and Accountability Research Centre at UCT, chatting about tenure security. This is in relation to customary land rights as well as dispossession. It's going to be some of the focus points at the land conference, which she mentioned is taking place this week. As we continue to highlight some of the other stories coming through this week, volunteers from mining-affected communities across the country are going to plan to camp outside of Parliament on the 16th of August. It's over issues within the mining industry following the recent rape of 8 women by alleged illegal miners in Krugersdorp, as well as to commemorate the Marikana massacre. For more, Mishak Mbangula, the National Coordinator of Mining-Affected Communities United in Action, Makua, joins us for more. Misha, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Just very quickly, as we look at the current realities that are faced by mining communities to date, walk us through some of those challenges. Perhaps how do the existing mining laws also affect the communities?
Well, for instance, the MPRT, Mineral and Petroleum Resource Developmental Act, it doesn't really help communities that are affected by mining, even the artisanal miners. It only talks about the big mines, and when we have those who are working the mines, especially the artisan miners, now they go back as zamazamas, and we engage the DMRE to say, look, let's formalize this sector so that we can be able to know and they can be able to contribute to the economy of South Africa. But we'll talk about 10 years back when we were engaging them, because what happened is the real problem is that the mine did not rehabilitate. They are the ones who left those open shafts, those tailings dam, and now the people who worked in the mine will go back there and work in the mines and go back there and do the very same thing. But we wanted that to formalize it so that he can even assist to reduce the unemployment rate. In that regard, we'll be able to do something. But unfortunately, not only the law doesn't cover it, we tried to engage the MRE on these issues. Unfortunately, that will fall into deaf ears.
So Mishak, given the current socio-economic crisis that the world over is facing, the global financial crisis, as well as commodity demands, even conditions here at home, how are conditions being exacerbated in your opinion?
Well, for instance, now the Gwede the minister, wants to use 140 million a month to close those shafts. And we can use for 17 years, that's what he says. And if we can use that money, 140 million, to assist in formalizing the Zamazamas, and obviously there's a lot that comes out of Zamazam because we've got more than 50,000 of them. So if whatever they get from those mines, it ends up in the formal state, in the formal sector. So these guys are being used to go and mine there, and they buy that very cheap. So we need to formalize that, to transform that sector to a formal sector so that it can have economic leverage in South Africa. Because now, if you are not doing that, the government is not coming with any issues of creating jobs. But this is, it's just that our government is arrogant. This is a sector that can be transformed to change the economy of South Africa, to change the life of people, to reduce the number of unemployment. And by formalizing them, because if we involve those people to say, how can you come up with policies that will guide this sector? They've been there, they know the sector, and we can have policies that will obviously agree with what they are doing and be a right sector. But because now you talk to TMR, they say they're not prepared to talk to criminals. They say those people are criminals. But if we have engaged 10 years back, we'll have reduced even the issues like what happened in Krugersdorp, because now we'll be having to know who's working there.
Well, it's obviously calling for transformation within the mining sector and formal engagement. Also, just speaking to Nokwanda earlier on, she really spoke about and emphasized the need for the policy processes to really involve informed consent, which I know is part of the march you had earlier this year as well. Perhaps, in conclusion, you could speak to government's response ahead of the protest and also the state of readiness ahead of the rally and the call to action. I mean, at the end of the day, women were also affected. So we also have to look at women and their role in this male-dominated sector.
Yeah, especially women in mining areas are very much affected. You must know that is even from the areas of where they collect people. Women, when their husbands dies, they are the one who take the responsibility. In fact, women are more affected with the issues of pollution, polluted water. They use all those things. And unfortunately, they benefit nothing but these sicknesses from the mines. What is worse is that mines, when we talk about free, prior, informed consent principles, to be legislated so that we can be able to hold them accountable when we talk about meaningful consultation, so that we can be able to put our ideas, information, and let them understand what is it that we are as communities want. Because what happened is the companies, multinational companies, come in as investors, but they only come to loot and invade the country, loot minerals and go away, leave the country open. And again, the government doesn't understand that is how we can create business opportunities, employment, if we look at all these sectors. And the government should again look at how can we be strict on issues of GBV in the mining area.
All right, Mishak Mbangula, just in terms of the state of readiness, walk us through what the plans are for the protest action that's going to be taking place very quickly.
Just last thing, Cape Town now, because on the 60th we'll be doing a where we will want to go in by force to let them make sure that they pay attention in engaging us in policy making, developing economy, and in mining. we will force ourselves on the 16th to go in there because we remember even Marikana where people were shot when they were only asking for decent wages. And again, obviously, the issue of those women who were raped in Krugersdorp. It's all the biggest economy sabotage is the government himself.
All right, Mishak, unfortunately, we ran out of time. We're going to leave the conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us. Mishak Mangula is the National Coordinator of Mining Affected Communities United in Action, or MAKUA. Joining us ahead of volunteers of affected mining areas and communities across the country who plan to camp outside of Parliament on the 16th of August. Again, as he mentioned, to highlight some of the issues within the mining industry and also commemorate the Marikana massacre. We've come to the end of the show. Thank you very much for joining us. Do have a safe week ahead. That's where we leave it for you today. Of course, back next week for a look at the weekend review. For myself, Liesl Wilson and the team, until next time, it's goodbye for now. Do take care.